Alrighty, welcome back to another video. I'm here with Samuel,
Hi everyone.
and as you can see, we are trying something new. Some of our viewers actually wanted us to, go for a Duel Commander tier bracket, and we thought about it for some time, and now we sit together and we have a look at the current from today, the current top 20 decks on MTG top 8. Keep in mind that some of those decks can change depending on when you look at MTG top 8, but here we are. And together we made our thoughts up front about all those decks, and we will go through the commanders step by step and exchange our thoughts. Sometimes, I think in most of the cases, we will agree. Sometimes we might disagree, which
You'll get to
opens up for
see.
some interesting debates. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one more thing that we need to add up front is that so we're looking at S to D tier here, and I I hope Felix did as well, but I kind of ranked mine in comparison to each other. Because there is definitely like if we did this along the lines of possible decks, all of these commanders would be in S tier. Because just of the amount of legendary creatures that there are, and you can play you can play a vanilla 08 for 2 mana, and that would probably still be better than quite a few other legends that exist in Magic. Um, and yeah, I think this only really makes sense to look at it as a kind of breakdown of the Dual Commander metagame, as opposed to attempting to rank thousands of cards and decks built around those cards. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. There is among or above these 20 commanders, there is a lot more, and we just don't. It doesn't really make sense to rank all of those as well. There will be some B and C and D tier decks that exist beyond these cards. And yeah, they're just not going to be on the list. It doesn't really make that much sense. So we're looking at kind of a slice of the metagame of the point in time that we're making this video, and I think we're going from there, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, we are looking. I would not. I mean, if we compare all the legendary creatures to each other, I agree to you. Then we would have all those legendaries put into S tier in comparison to what other legendaries are mostly not capable of in Duel Commander. Then again, we took these top 20 decks, and within this range, we're going to evaluate them because some people will say it's tier 0, it's tier 1, it's tier 2. I think that's the broad span of evaluation, I would say. But as you said, comparing each of those decks to each other, um, yeah, that's a very good addition here. Almost forgot about that. Let's start. Let's give it a go with the first legendary, which is Hei Bai.
Okay. Yeah. Where did you put Hei Bai?
Where did I put Hei Bai? So I actually put Hei Bai into the C category.
Okay. Yeah, I think that is a debatable thing. I put him into D tier,
Mhm.
because if he's not in D tier, then I don't think that anything is really in D tier. Um, as kind of as our first pick, I think this is a card that, it presents a pretty good game plan, but as we saw, the amount of interaction that is like there used to be a time when just no enchantment hate would be played. And if we're
Yeah.
looking at that time, sure, but most decks have some way to answer the shrines. And if that happens, then Hei Bai is in a pretty bad state. And yeah, I think just overall the deck is probably a little bit too slow. And I would say Yeah, I would put him in D tier compared to the rest of the cards here.
Okay. Um, I think so. When we look at the card, we're going to compare it to all the other control decks there are, or the control commanders, which are mainly, Tivit, Atraxa, Tazigur, and Hidetsugu, at least regarding those 20 commanders. And I agree to all the points you mentioned. I think so. We have a 5-color deck that can't really lean into using the entire 5-color pool because it would end up being way too inconsistent regarding the mana base, which means most of those decks end up in playing the Esper Shell. Then we have this thing about you have a commander that on its own is not really pressuring or not really it's not really a threat with which you can finish the game in comparison to Atraxa or Tivit, for example. Then sometimes, your trigger resolves once, which with the most prominent shrine setup, you end up in finding one of those and you draw one card more a turn, which is not too crazy. And then you have a 4/4 vanilla bear that you're trying to get rid of because you need a second cast in order to make more use of your shrines.
Yep.
And then there's this interaction with the shrines. Sometimes there is a Canker Bloom on field or a Haywire Might and stuff like this lurking around. And sometimes it's just a brazen borrow, a petty theft in this case, that will bounce it back to hand. And another aspect with the build around the shrines, most of the decks only feature 3 shrines, so the 5-color one and the 2 blue ones that would draw cards. But if you have those cards in hand, it basically means that you have a bad draw because you never want to draw them and you don't want them on your starting hand because playing those cards for mana is more or less a time walk for your opponent, unless you're very much ahead, which is not really the case with this deck. So I can agree to put it either in C or D tier. Amongst the current control decks, it's definitely the worst.
Yep. And I think it also faces the problem that some of these control decks face. I think that's something that Atraxa faces as well, is that it's very reliant on you hitting every single land drop.
Hmm.
I think that's something that Spider-Man and Tazigor kind of compensate for pretty well, where you can go a turn or two without hitting a land drop in those decks, but in Hei Bai, you have to hit every land drop in order to cast him on curve and kind of keep going afterwards. And sometimes if you don't get enough support in your 99 from that you've basically already lost the game when you miss your first land
Exactly.
drop.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. Okay. Next up, let's go over to Asmo. Where did you assign Asmo to?
I put Asmo in B tier. I think
Okay.
it's a strong deck. Maybe I'm a bit biased because you play it very well. Um, but yeah, I think most decks in the format be should be to some extent scared of Asmo coming of an opponent sitting down with Asmo. It has very, very strong fast aggro lines. It has a removal spell built into the commander, which means it's pretty interactive as well. It does take till turn 3 to use that removal spell most of the time, but that's not very slow. And it still has a very good 99 around the rest of it. I think it's a I think it's probably underplayed, I would say, but maybe you having played the deck quite a bit more have more insights into the worst draws of the deck.
Mm. So I would definitely not place it in B tier. I personally place it in C tier actually, because from playing the deck in paper and especially on MTGO against several archetypes, overall my impression is that it's too slow for the current metagame. The support there is for discard like synergies is okay. What I think the deck needs in order to be placed higher is many, many more consistent turn 1 plays, which is currently only available due to 3 cards. And the fact that you're trading your second turn in 80% of the times for cycle, like paying 1 mana for the cycle plus playing Asmo, is for an aggressive deck with a couple of cheesy but not too many strategies is too fair, I think, in the current metagame. It is definitely a good deck against aggressive archetypes, and it also fares quite well against the current boogeymans of the format, Tazigor and Spider-Man. Those matchups are not too problematic, but from my experience, there's so many things that can go wrong, and I guess it needs much more support in order to compete on the same level in terms of pace as well as playing unfair Magic. You have those graveyard shenanigans that you can bring up all over again, and some of them are pretty powerful, but they need very specific setup actually in order to come down. Yeah, so after all, I think it's a bit too cute. I really love playing the deck. It's a very unique type of deck, and it's lots of fun. It never gets boring because it's full of decision making, and you never have, or you rarely face the same pattern twice. So that's definitely a big plus from my side. But again, in comparison to what all the other decks here in this list can bring up, I think Asmo is a bit behind, to be honest.
Interesting. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I'm not sure if I agree. I feel like
That's fair. That's fair.
it's more B than it is C, but it's not like what I'm saying it's S and you're saying it's D. It's a very small difference here, and we'll see how the rest of our list kind of shapes out to put that into more perspective.
Yeah, I think it's also when along the line when we talk about the other legends, maybe we get to a point where you compare two of those, and then maybe there's like some kind of realization. Now, maybe it's a bit better than we talked about it, 20 minutes ago and stuff. But we will see. Next up, we have Hidetsugu and Kairi, a deck that I personally had a bit of a problem assigning the right tier because um, amongst all of those cards, I think this is the one that we have the least insights. Marcus was playing the deck for quite some time, but it was almost a year ago.
Yeah.
And back then, the metagame was very different. It was a very powerful deck. These days, we see it from time to time, and I still think it's good, but I personally placed it in the B tier because, it has the good part about the deck is it plays counter magic, which can interact with almost anything your opponent does. The Dimir card pool has limited but effective interaction against things lying on the board. And you have a combo plan, which in most cases wins you the game instantly because of the power spells the deck plays, like Rise of the Eldrazi's and the spells that the deck runs in order to win games. And again, featuring combos in Duel Commander is something that even control decks need to do these days. So we have Atraxa, which features Dream Holes. We have Atazigur with Jace. This is much more reliable because there are more cards that can lead to a combo win. I'm not sure if I'm a bit biased because of the fact that we don't see Hidetsugu too often, but I think whenever there is, because there's always a mix between popularity and a deck really being good. Spider-Man, we talked about Spider-Man in the latest ban update, is very, very popular, but might not be as good as both of us think. Then again, Hidetsugu and Kairi, it still speaks for itself if a card is not super popular. If this, or to explain it a bit differently, if this card would be extremely busted as a control commander, we would see it much more often.
Yeah.
I'm very certain about that. That's not the case. And I might be wrong with the B tiering. Maybe it's even A,
Okay.
but I'll place it in B. What do you say?
I put it in C tier. Um,
Okay.
Mostly because something that how do I say this? Like for tournaments and for tournament performance, I feel like picking decks that have very strong, consistent game plans is something that gives you the ability to say, okay, I'm going to play my deck as well as I can, and my deck is going to perform in the absolute most of the times, and if that works out, you're going to do very well at the tournament. Hidetsugu and Kairi is a deck that is very RNG based. You have
Mhm.
lots of situations where you either draw the high CMC spells that you want to flip with them when they die. You either draw them too early, or you don't draw them at all, or you have situations where early game you have to you need all your interactions, so you use a brainstorm, you shuffle away your high CMC cards, and then you don't find them again for the rest of the game. You have a lot of situations where or you have the case where you have one or two of them, and by the time you get to your fifth land drop, you suddenly don't you haven't actually gotten there because you're missing land drops, or you don't your hand is weighed down by those cards. You don't get to play all your spells. You have these useless cards. I think that goes like something that speaks to that kind of effect is Tazigur cutting the Hellbreacher horror combo. Mm, that's a small downside that happens with one card where
Mhm.
you don't get to cast where you know you have the issue of having to try and cast a 7 mana spell and another card being dead. And Hidetsugu and Kairi has this problem much more. When we were playing it in our metagame, Dark Ritual wasn't banned yet. Force of Will wasn't
That's
banned
true.
yet.
Very true, yeah.
Um, and I think those are two cards that give much better high rolls for this deck. And yeah, I feel like the deck hasn't gotten better; it's gotten worse with the bannings, and I would say, um, and
And also with new prints, right?
and
Just new commanders arrived, yeah.
yeah, and new cards exactly. So for me, the card is like it might be fun to play, but it also has the big downside of having those situations where you have 3 mana and you're trying to find your Toxic Deluge, and you hit an Eldrazi whatever and a Sorin's Vengeance, and you haven't done anything. Like where y- you get screwed by the fact that you have, I don't know if it's 7 or 8 high CMC, really strong spells that don't end up doing anything when you actually need them to.
Mm. Yeah, those are all valid arguments, I think. It's to me it's the classic A plus B plus C commander or combo deck in this case. You have, if you compare it to Aminatu a little bit as a reanimator deck that has some self defense in the form of counter spells. This goes in a similar direction. You need your commander, you need a big spell, and you need a sacrifice outlet in order to trigger Hidetsugu. Um, I always thought what was the upside of this card or the deck was that there isn't too much incidental hate against this strategy, Then again, if you have a look at the match that we played back then with Plagon against Hidetsugu and Kairi, where you played it on cam,
Yep,
I happened to have some random effects on board, like Draniv, and there was this Crystal Barricade, I think it's called,
yep.
that you would probably not feature in Plagon, but I played it back then because I liked the card. So there are a couple of effects, but not too many. Whereas against reanimated strategies and other combos, you have much more to offer. That's definitely an upside, but overall, I think, yeah, you might be right here. I rather agree to even tiering it down now. Well, this will be probably one of those cards where I would be very interested about what our viewers say about. Also, because maybe we have some invested Hidetsugu and Kairi players in the community, and maybe they will put their thoughts down below. I would be very curious about that.
Something that is very interesting. One more thing that I would like to add.
Hmm.
It will be more apparent when we talk about Spider-Man, but the one of the better combos in the deck is the 17 damage you get to do off flipping Soren's Vengeance with Hidetsugu and Kairi. That
Hmm.
is that's a combo that costs you quite a bit of setup and 5 mana plus a way to um, sacrifice Hidetsugu and Kairi. Spider-Man gets to do 18 damage with 1 card in addition to the commander, and gets to
Yeah,
do that for 3 mana in
yeah,
total, and, still have counterspell protection up around that. So,
that's true.
just to kind of, g one I think it's something that the deck isn't bad, and the deck will definitely win games, and the combo I just mentioned is a combo that can win at games, but I feel like if you're looking for these kind of one-shot combos, damage-based, Spider-Man does it better than Hidetsugu and Kairi does.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair. Mm, and I think there are even more examples to bring up, comparing it to other command zones. Like the ratio between impact and costs.
Yep.
But let's not talk too much about this guy. Next up, I have to ask you, obviously, where would you put Terra?
Yeah,
Into which category?
I put her in B tier. That might
Okay.
be a bit generous, but there is a big big range of decks that you can play with her, which in my opinion kind of puts her a little bit higher than other commanders would be, because you have quite a few slots and a deck with many tutors to have access to those slots, which can sideboard for specific metagames. So it's a deck that can very easily run Opposition Agent. It's a deck that can play other one card uh, good answers to what some strategies are doing. And the mid range decks are very interactive and provide the kind of perfect shell to do a value game plan that can only be rivaled, I would say, by Slimefoot. And on that axis, Terra gets to be a lot better working around graveyard hate than Slimefoot is, even in the mid range plan, but also in the kind of, how would I say? My game plan is a little bit less. It's not full reanimator, but it's in the kind of flicker game plan. I still use my graveyard. I still reanimate a lot, but I can also kind of pivot to a less graveyard hate plan, and kind of the flexibility of that deck, I would say, puts it pretty well into B tier. Could be A, could be C, but I don't think it's S, and it's definitely not D.
Yeah, I would mostly agree. I also put it in B tier. There are various things that I took into account. I mean, I played the deck myself once, just picking up your pile. I faced it numerous times playing against you, playing against Marcos. You played the deck at the Relic Fest. I played it with several decks on cam, outside of cam. So I also faced it a couple of times on MTGO with different decks. I have a good understanding on the opposing side. Mm, there are two variants walking around. There's the mid-range variant and there's the more reanimator version. Either of those versions has certain difficulties, or like certain challenges to deal with. But again, in comparison to what other decks can bring up, I think it's sometimes a bit too cute, or it needs like very specific lineups in order to do very powerful, unfair things. Personally, I liked the all-in variant that I would describe your variant as an all-in variant.
Yeah.
I liked it a bit more because it's leaning much more into the power plays. The mid-range variant is currently more popular, I think, because it can grind out games and it's easier to adapt your deck as well as the game plan to certain strategies and, grind your way through, making a bit more use of the Terra flip itself and stuff like this. Yeah, I think most people would agree that it's not an A-tier commander, and yeah, most of the time I would say we just agree here that it's neither. It's definitely not C and D, but something above the first two categories. I would say, or the second and the third.
Yeah.
Okay, next up we have um, Satya, and you told me in the beginning that there is no deck apart from Hei Bai that you would put into D category.
No, 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 not absolutely not.
Actually,
I didn't say that, and, I'm absolutely with you. Satya for
okay,
me
then
is
then
a
maybe
D
I
tier
miss
deck.
maybe I misunderstood you. Maybe I thought you were saying that this is probably the only deck that would end up in D category,
No,
in
I
regarding Hei
said
Bai.
if Hei Bai isn't a D tier deck, then no deck is a D tier deck.
Ah,
So,
okay, my bad. Yeah,
Hei Bai being a D tier deck means that Satya can definitely also be a D tier deck.
yeah, and that was actually my only commander that I put into the D tier category. It was Satya for various reasons. I think the Jeskai card pool is definitely strong. We saw that with Aragorn for quite some time. Both decks actually share lots of cards. Mm, but I talked about that in the game where I played Magda against Satya in Strasbourg. I casted that together with Jean Alexis, and we talked about the dynamic of Satya a little bit. And I was never a big fan of the deck, to be honest, because back then it was definitely interesting and it can definitely bring up some powerful things. The main problem is you need to have like a certain board setup in order for your commander to be useful, or let's say worth being played for 4 mana. And then the most powerful lineups that you can come up with, I think, always evolve around Pyroglyph and Broadside Bombardiers. Maybe there's a third one that I missed here. But in comparison to the pace that all of the other decks these days bring up, I think it's just too slow. It's too cute. And there are so many ways of interacting with this game plan. Even if you can squeeze in some counter magic, I'm not really sure if I was never convinced to bring this card to a serious tournament. And these days, I would definitely not do it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it exactly as you described, it has this big issue of you have to you have to untap with a good creature in order for it to be worth it playing Satya. And the games where you're doing that, you're usually winning anyway. I kind of in a broad sense. Playing an Aragorn would also win you the game there,
Yeah,
but Aragorn wins you a lot more situations than Satya does. Satya has lines that kill very quickly. If the opponent isn't interacting at all, then you can usually goldfish with Satya on turn 4 because you are playing a pretty aggressive deck with a bit of interaction and sneak in that that turn 4 Satya cast just can do a lot of damage. If not turn 3, then definitely the second turn that Satya gets to attack. However, that is not going to be the case if we're looking at, this field. The decks are either incredibly fast themselves or interactive or both. And usually you are not going to get to untap with your 3-drop
yeah,
because the quality of removal is good enough as well and all of these factors. If you do get to copy a Skyclave Apparition and exile another card from the opponent, these kind of lines, they are very, very strong, and there will be games where the opponent is cold to those sorts of synergy lines. But I would say in the vast majority of games, the deck doesn't quite do enough, and in the in the control matchup, Satya is not a very good card. It, it you are not expecting to be untapping with creatures or having creatures lying around anyway, and then playing a 3/5 for 4 and then for 6 and then for 8. These kind of lines are not kind of the strong things you want to be doing. So you have to rely very much on your 99 in the control matchups, and that's just yeah. I've lost to the game to the deck at tournaments before, and that's totally understandable. It can have strong draws, but I feel like when you play Yoshi, you before a tournament you make an active decision of okay, sometimes I'm just gonna lose because my draws weren't good enough. You don't have tutor magic or a lot of tutor magic, and you don't have a lot of card selection. And the blue that Satya adds to your deck doesn't compensate for that. So yeah, I feel like Satya is squarely in D tier, and yeah, that's just that's it.
Yeah, let's leave it at that. No more to add. And have a look at Tivit. What is your feeling regarding this card? Very popular a couple of years ago. We see it every now and then, and there are some very experienced pilots with it that still score big results. But apart from that, it feels a bit out of fashion.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for me, I put it in C tier. I
Oh,
think
okay.
it's not a I would say it's better than a than a Satya. It's most of the time gonna be better than Hei Bai as well. Having the kind of ability to tap out for your commander and be relatively sure that the opponent either has to commit his whole turn to recasting Tivit, to killing Tivit, um, or just let him be around. That kind of removal installation of the ward pay 3 mana is pretty good, and also the ability for, once it ETBs, you make 2 treasures, which means that if you that you will, if it does get removed, recast him the turn afterwards most of the time, is, I think, a good enough dynamic to say, okay, the Esper card pool is a card pool that does do a pretty good job of controlling the game most of the time. You have board wipes, you have very specific removal, you have counter spells, and you have quite a few good card draw spells. And I would say it's not as good as Atraxa because Atraxa kind of does the refueling instantly once it resolves. But yeah, I think it's better than D tier, and yeah, I think C tier is
Okay.
fine for it.
Interesting. I personally put it in B tier actually, because I
Okay.
think it's not that bad of a deck. I think it's a bit out of fashion because for all the positive reasons that you mentioned, the card itself is pretty good. It fits the control shell very well, brings some self protection, brings card advantage, etc., etc. I think the reason I would not put it in A tier, for example, is that in comparison to most of these decks, or especially the control decks, we said that regarding Tazigur, Atraxa, and Hidetsugu, there is no combo included. There might be a combo that could be included, but I've never seen a combo. And I think these days, you don't have the time to play out those grindy control matchups. And that's why most of those control decks want to have a combo added, to sneak in some wins. This is one downside. But then again, I still think the Esper card pool is the best you can have in for control, actually. I mean, there could be some red spells added that, would complete the suit, so to say. But I still think it's a fine card. I think it's actually a bit overshadowed by the presence of Spider-Man, because I could imagine that some of those pilots that were originally going for Tivit just moved over to Spider-Man because the deck is faster and a bit more efficient. But in itself, I don't think it's necessarily a bad decision to go with Tivit. But then again, I also have to add that I'm not a big control player, and also in most meta games, whether it's online or in paper tournaments, you don't face that many control matchups because in order to enjoy, this land draw, land go archetype or way of playing, it's usually a certain type of player. Martin was this kind of player. He enjoyed Tivit. He enjoyed other control decks very much. And if he would still be playing in our group, then we would face those control decks much more often, and then we would probably also have like a much more educated thought on that. I'm a bit hesitant, but I also was a bit hesitant, like evaluating Hidetsugu, to be fair. So might not be the most precise evaluation here regarding Tivit.
Yeah. So you haven't convinced me. I'm still putting it in C tier, but I think my just as a kind of calibration, would you how many, not to spoil anything, but how many S and A tier commanders combined do you have?
Combined,
Yeah.
10.
Okay. I have 4.
Okay,
So,
interesting. Interesting.
so
So
yeah, I
you're a
think
bit more
that's
strict, yeah?
I'm
That's fine.
I'm very much my big center is the B tier, which you will see for the remaining commanders, for
That's
a lot of
fine.
the remaining counters. So yeah, I think that's if we're going on a such saying that so many decks are A tier, then I would probably put Tivit in a tier above Hidetsugu and Kairi as well. My kind of baseline is more of a B tier, but yeah, well,
That's fair.
yeah,
We will show you both our individual tier lists at the end of this video. The point is rather to debate for each card on its own. And maybe with some of those commanders, we can convince you to play them or not to play them because they're currently not very well suited for what you are facing on the battlefield. Let's go over to Atraxa, which is the first card I will put into A tier.
yeah,
I think it's not the craziest control deck anymore. It was a very, very good control deck for some time, but that's more to the fact that control is currently suffering from a lack of support, and it's having a hard time dealing with all those fast decks that have lots of interaction. Still, I think in comparison to Tivit, you have one color more, which doesn't add that much, but you still have some cards. We see Oko, we see Abrupt Decay. Um, there is this new 3-mana rock that grants life gain that is played. So you see a couple of things, right? And Atraxa itself is very, very powerful. And we have the Dreamholds combo, which is also much more accessible due to some tutors and lots of card draw. Yeah, I think it's struggling a little bit, but if we're talking about control decks, these days we do see Tazigur most of the time, but we also see some Atraxas because the deck is still able to compete with most of the strategies, and I don't really see a reason to value it or like to tier it below that.
yeah.
What are your
I
thoughts?
think I think how would I say this? I think for a deck to be in the for me, a deck to be in the A tier, the amount of I feel like the results of the deck shouldn't be skewed by the amount of really good players that play the deck. I feel like Atraxa is um, one of those decks that does require quite a lot of skill to play and has some very punishing moments of not having enough foresight to kind of anticipate the rest of the game in decisions that you make. I think it's a kind of a a general thing of control decks, and for me, that kind of puts the deck more in B tier because we have really good players playing the deck, and that gives the deck better results than I feel like it should have. For me, an Atraxa is not the most threatening thing that sits down against me at a tournament. I feel like there is quite a bit of counterplay to the deck. Something that really hurts can be land destruction, which quite a lot of decks have incidentally a bit of access to. And there are those avenues to attack the deck on, and it's also one of those decks that really, really struggles when it doesn't hit its land drops. So for me, having, all those weaknesses, having a commander that you have to get to 7 mana to cast most of the time, uh, and if not, then you're like, if you're using the combo, you often don't have information about the hand of the other player, so you're actually risking quite a lot to just cast out Dream Halls, um, which to me, yeah, I feel like Atraxa is a good deck. It's a great deck, but really difficult to play, really punishing to play, and I would put it more in B tier than in A tier.
Okay, yeah, those are fair arguments. I mean, it's always hard to say like whether or not the player skill it's or we should try to differentiate between results produced by a very good player with deck ABC, but it's actually very hard to differentiate between those results. Right now there because the deck is not too popular, as you said, it's very hard to pilot and make the right decisions. Then again, I think it's more like same as Tivit, not only because control is struggling a little bit right now, but it falls victim to the fact that Tazigor just arrived, and people are much more hyped to play Tazigor. And Tazigor, we will get there, but Tazigor might be the better card in the end, and that's why people prefer to play it. Mm,
Yep. I think that's also a kind of point of reference. Tazigor, in my eyes, is quite a bit better than Atraxa by I would say at least a tier. And yeah,
yeah, I
that's why I'm
think
putting Atraxa more in B
into
tier.
B tier. Okay, yeah. I mean, we will get to Tazigor later on. Both of those decks have very lots of power in a given time, like in a certain window. And since the entire metagame drifts towards the early games, Tazigor is obviously the one shining much brighter, right? But yeah, let's talk about that later on and continue with definitely one of the boogeymans.
Yep.
So I'm curious to hear where you put Spider-Man.
In D tier. I think it's pretty bad, and I don't think it should be played.
Okay.
No, of course. As anyone who listened to our broadcast about the ban list update, I'm putting no, Tazigor, Spider-Man in S tier. I think it's incredibly strong. It mostly because of those synergy lines that you have with the commander itself. The amount of pressure that it produces just based on, having it being in the command zone and having the possibility of one of the well, sort of one-shot kill cards being in the hand, um, means that you get to a state in the game where you have to have instant speed answers open for Spider-Man every turn if you want to even think about winning the game. And if that's not the case, then yeah, pretty tough. And the fact that it has access to, the full blue suite of counterspells, gets to play the cryptic commands, the Mystic Confluence, just basically not do anything except counter all your spells until it gets to winning the game with a 2-card combo. One of the cards being in the command zone, I think is puts it pretty squarely above basically everything else in the format.
Mm. Yeah, I can totally agree to that. I mean, when we had the talk with Flavion, he mentioned that it's one of those decks that has lots of 50-50 matchups in the metagame. And when you look at other formats, having a deck that has lots of 50% chances of winning a game is actually pretty good. And then Spider-Man definitely falls under that category. And I think there's not much to add. Everyone knows the card and the playstyle by now, and they know how it plays against the whatever deck you bring up at the tournament. Mm, it is certainly very popular, which shouldn't be that big of an argument for or against it. But yeah, there's just very much to the playstyle of this deck, and I think it's one of the few within this category. And it's not really related to having, I don't know, 30% on MTG top 8 or even more, even less. Um, just that,
What? You mean 13?
yeah, I said 13.
Okay. It
Yeah,
sounded like 30 to me. Okay.
30 would be crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's that. And I think we agree here. Let's look at a card that I played in a focus session some time ago, a couple of months ago. It was Aang, the Swift Airbender, I think.
Swift Savior.
Swift Savior, thank you. Um, I personally placed this guy into the B category.
Okay. So I think this is one of the first commanders that we have 2 tiers in difference on, but maybe that's just, um yeah,
So my thoughts on the cards are, or on the cards are that, the other Azorius card pool is pretty fine. There's not much to complain about. The flexibility in terms of interacting with what your opponent does in combination or together with the airband ability is there's quite a lot of flexibility to that. There's also lots of shenanigans you can do inside the deck. It's one of those classic tempo decks that we were looking forward to play before Aragorn arrived. Also, the fact that your commander is not limited to being a 2/3, but rather that you can spend some mana to flip it, and this gives you like a finisher or a potential finisher. I think this deck is actually fine. It's nothing too crazy, but there, and it's also not super popular, but we see some results every now and then, and I think the deck is capable to deal with most of the things that come up in this meta game. So yeah, that would
yeah,
be my statement here.
interesting. My tiering maybe falsely is, is in D tier. I feel
Mm.
like if an opponent sits down against me with an Aang Swift Savior, I'm not really that scared, but that might be because we played it, on cam, the list wasn't that polished yet, and we were playing not that great commanders against it. Um, which, maybe that was kind of maybe that skewed it for me, but I feel like it's not that dangerous of a deck, especially because, the Azurius card pool, it produces a lot of 2 power creatures. There isn't that much pressure that comes from the deck in terms of the damage that it does in combat, but maybe that's also not quite I'm right now tabbed out a bit and looking through some lists, and I feel like they're looking pretty good. Um, what it doesn't have much of is card advantage.
Yeah, that's what I was about to
Um,
say. That this is definitely a big problem here.
which means that if the 7 cards that you draw at the beginning of the game don't line up very well against the 7 cards the opponent draws at the beginning of the game, sometimes you're gonna be losing games. But yeah, maybe my notion of it, I think B tier is fine. I would maybe kind of my initial thought of D tier is probably wrong. I think it's probably better than Hei Bai or Satya.
Yeah, I think it's definitely better than Satya. So I would put it at least in C tier. More flexible and, really, how do you say, like stripped down to what it should do. In comparison to that, also depends on the Satya variants, but some people try to squeeze a tempo game plan into Satya. Some add many more counter spells. Uh, so that's more like a deck building debate here, I guess. But I think it's pretty straightforward. It has some cool synergies inside, and as I said, it. I definitely get what you're saying with not really too scared to face Aang. I mean, the downside that you always have with these kinds of effects is similar to airtie. Your opponent, or like Deadpool in a command zone, your opponent can actually calculate with your commander coming down at some point, and that makes the effect itself much worse. Then again, it gives a shell, or it gives a commander for a shell that many people enjoy playing, and there's quite a good card pool for that available. So yeah, whenever you feel bored by Aragon, which is probably the better deck, we get to that in a bit. Um, you could just swap to a bit of a faster game plan in some cases, and sometimes maybe not. What I personally like a lot about the Azorius card pool is that it's very close to White Weenie for obvious reasons. So you can squeeze in those sideboard effects or sideboard cards um, that are useful against certain metagames. Like sometimes you want to take a bit more against Storm, which we had in the Roguerak meta. Sometimes you might want to take against lands, which is not too. You can do it. There are some cards, but it's not too crazy, to be honest. But you get my point, right? You
Yeah.
can squeeze in some hate beers, and that's, I think, is a deck building wise, and like s- quote unquote sideboarding wise, that's a cool thing to do with those Azorius decks.
Yeah, and
With
I
the
think
backup of counter spells to protect those things, that's
exactly.
very important
The
here.
Azorius Flash plan has access to a couple of cards like Hullbreacher or
Containment
Amberless
Priest, things like
Spawn,
this. Yeah.
Containment Priest, these cards. I think another card that uh, will be pretty strong in quite a lot of matchups that doesn't always see play anymore is Dranith. Um,
Hmm.
Dranith being on board has a really strong synergy with Aang, but also, sometimes you play a turn to Dranith and the opponent's like, okay, shit, I don't have any removal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And now I can't cast my commander, I can't follow my game plan, and what am I gonna do?
Yeah.
There are those lineups that are very strong.
Definitely. Okay. More or less, last but not least, we will make a cut after 10 commanders, and you will see the next 10, or the last 10, if you so will, in a second part. But let's talk about Aragon. I would
Yeah.
assume that this is one of the cards that we both agree on where to put it. Because
All right. I'm curious. I'm putting it in B tier. I feel like
no, no, no,
it's
no. A in Aragon stands for A tier. Like,
okay. Well,
okay. Go
every
go go
time
ahead.
every time you've picked up the deck in the last year, you played it for like 3 games or like, "Fuck this, I'm never playing this deck again," and never picked it up again. So, I feel like it doesn't quite earn the spot of A tier,
Okay.
anymore. It's definitely a strong deck. You should never be shields down against an Aragorn, um, but I feel like it occupies the same kind of, like, baseline of this is an okay commander. We and yeah, I but that kind of comes down to our difference there maybe comes down to the the distribution that we have. I put very very little decks in A tier and only one deck in S tier,
Hmm.
and that makes B tier very full for me.
So I think when I actually said that the deck doesn't seem to be that good anymore was last time. I think I played it in a focus session against Marcus when he was playing. I don't remember the deck anymore, but I said that this might be the last time that I bring up Aragon, since I just feel that Spider Man is the better deck. And that's the case, in my opinion. So I would definitely not tier it equally. If that would be the case, then it would see many more Aragorns trying to compete on the field against Spider-Man, right? That's currently not the case. But I would still say it's a very, very strong commander. Very good suit of interaction. Jeskai card pool, very, very powerful. It's just the classic mid-range plan with some card advantage on top of it. And lifelink helps a lot. The combat mechanic that you deny your opponent from blocking is still here. Still a somewhat toxic aspect to some people. So I would personally rank it higher than those decks, especially if you. I mean, this will fill much more, especially if you put so many cards in B tier. But especially if you put it into comparison to the other decks, I think it definitely deserves a slot here. And if all of that did not convince you, then it's still A for Aragon. I think that's fine. Okay. We
Fair
are
enough.
done with 10 cards, 10 commanders. And we will see each other in the second part talking about the next 10 decks.
All right.
Thanks
See you
for
next time.
see you next time.